My parents abandoned me on my graduation day to throw a lavish yacht party for my golden child brother. They called my dual doctorate a pathetic joke and demanded I wire them $15,000 to pay for their champagne. They had absolutely no idea that before the day was over, a multi-billion-dollar corporate titan would hand me the exact weapon I needed to wipe their entire arrogant existence off the map. My name is Savannah, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who treated your biggest achievements like absolute garbage. Growing up in a wealthy Connecticut suburb, my parents, Richard and Catherine, worshipped only one thing: money, status, and corporate power were their entire religion. My older brother Cameron was their anointed savior. He was a flashy, fast-talking tech bro who practically lived in custom-tailored suits and threw around investor cash like it was monopoly money. I, on the other hand, was the family embarrassment. Why? Because I loved science. Because my greatest passion was healing animals and studying complex genetics. To my elitist parents, veterinary medicine was a blue-collar joke. They constantly reminded me that playing with sick dogs would never secure a prestigious seat at their exclusive country club table. Fast forward to a crisp May morning. I was standing in the massive parking lot of Cornell University, the cool wind gently catching the heavy black fabric of my graduation gown. This was not just a regular graduation. I was about to walk across the stage to receive a dual Doctor of Veterinary Medicine and a PhD in Genetic Biotechnology. It took me nearly a decade of sleepless nights, grueling lab hours, and surviving entirely on meager student grants. My parents had adamantly refused to pay a single cent for a degree they deemed financially worthless, leaving me to claw my way to the top of my academic field entirely on my own. I nervously smoothed down my velvet doctoral hood, scanning the sea of arriving families. I was desperately searching for my parents' luxury SUV. I had sent them the gold-embossed invitation 6 months ago. I had even used my limited savings to book them a premium hotel suite near the campus. Despite a lifetime of emotional neglect, the inner child inside me wanted so desperately to believe that today, just for one afternoon, they would show up and finally be proud of me. Then my phone vibrated in my hand. It was a text message from my mother, Catherine. I opened the message, and the harsh words on the screen hit me like a physical punch to the chest. "We are not coming to your pointless ceremony. Being a vet is the pinnacle of failure, and we refuse to be embarrassed in front of our friends by celebrating it. We are currently hosting a private yacht party for Cameron. He just closed a massive new funding round for his tech startup. Wire $15,000 to his account immediately to cover the champagne. Consider it back rent for us raising you." I stared at the glowing screen, my vision blurring with hot, angry tears. I was breathing heavily, trying to process the staggering cruelty of her words. My own mother was blowing off the culmination of my life's work for a boat party and having the sheer audacity to charge me for their expensive liquor. My hands shook violently as I pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before someone finally answered. It was not my mother. Over the loud, thumping bass of party music and the clinking of crystal glasses, my father Richard barked aggressively into the receiver. "What do you want, Savannah?" he snapped. "We are busy celebrating actual tangible success over here." I swallowed hard, trying with all my might to keep my voice from cracking. "Dad, it is my graduation day. I am about to get my doctorate. You promised you would be here." Richard let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed cruelly through the phone speaker. "What is there to celebrate about treating sick dogs? You have wasted a decade of your life playing in a petting zoo. Your brother is dealing with elite hedge funds. He is securing millions in corporate capital. That is what a real career looks like. I earned a PhD. Dad," I pleaded. The last pathetic shred of the daughter who just wanted her father's love was desperately fighting to survive. "I did it completely on my own. I did not ask you for anything. And you are still a broke embarrassment." Richard sneered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Did you wire the $15,000 yet? Your brother needs to entertain his wealthy investors. Send the money right now or lose our number for good. He did not wait for a response. The line went dead with a sharp click. I stood completely alone in the crowded parking lot, surrounded by joyful families hugging their smiling graduates. I reached into the hidden pocket of my graduation gown and pulled out a crisp folded cashier's check. It was a check for exactly $15,000. I had saved up every extra penny from my university stipend over the last 2 years to give them that money today. I had intended it to be a massive thank you gift for raising me a peace offering to finally earn their respect. I looked down at the check, then I looked at the dark, silent screen of my phone. The desperate approval-seeking girl inside me died right then and there on the asphalt. I took the thick paper between my fingers and slowly, deliberately tore it right down the middle. I stacked the halves and tore it again. I kept tearing until the $15,000 gift was reduced to tiny, worthless shreds of confetti. I opened my hand and let the pieces fall, watching them scatter wildly in the wind. I promised myself right there in the Cornell parking lot that this was the absolute last time Richard, Catherine, and Cameron would ever trample on my dignity. I turned off my phone, adjusted my doctoral cap, and walked toward the stadium with my head held high. I had absolutely no idea that in just a few short hours, a sleek armored vehicle would pull up to the curb and a billionaire stranger would hand me the ultimate weapon to destroy my family's fraudulent empire. The roar of the university stadium hit me like a physical wave as I walked through the massive double doors. Thousands of people packed the bleachers, cheering wildly for their children's siblings and friends. I found my seat among the doctoral candidates, a sea of velvet hoods and heavy academic regalia. As the ceremony dragged on, I watched my peers constantly checking their phones, waving frantically to their proud parents in the stands, and wiping away tears of joy. I sat perfectly still, my phone turned off, and buried deep in my pocket. I did not need to check it. I already knew exactly where my family was. They were standing on the polished deck of a rented luxury yacht, drinking expensive champagne and toasting to my brother's fraudulent tech success, entirely unbothered by my absence. When the university dean finally approached the massive wooden podium to announce the highest academic honors, the stadium quieted down. Then my name echoed through the massive speakers, vibrating in the crisp afternoon air. Dr. Savannah receiving a dual Doctor of Veterinary Medicine and a PhD in Genetic Biotechnology. The applause was deafening. I stood up, feeling the immense weight of the velvet hood resting on my shoulders. Every single grueling all-nighter, every skipped meal, every moment of crushing financial stress had led to this exact second. As I walked across the expansive wooden stage, my eyes instinctively scanned the VIP seating section where my parents were supposed to be sitting. The 4 premium seats I had reserved months in advance were completely empty. A few hours ago, that sight would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. But standing under the bright stage lights, grasping the heavy leather binder containing my hard-earned diplomas, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, icy liberation. The heavy chains of their toxic expectations had finally snapped. I shook the dean's hand, smiled brightly for the official university photographer, and walked off the stage as a completely free woman. Once the closing remarks finished and the sea of graduates erupted into chaotic celebration, I did not linger. I bypassed the crowded reception areas, where families were popping champagne corks, arranging massive bouquets of flowers, and taking endless photographs. I did not want to be the pathetic, isolated girl standing alone in the background of someone else's joyful memory. I navigated through the labyrinth of campus hallways, keeping my head down, heading toward the secluded rear exit of the stadium. I pushed open the heavy glass doors, expecting to find the quiet, empty sidewalk leading back to my cheap, off-campus apartment. Instead, my path was immediately and aggressively blocked. 2 massive men wearing impeccably tailored black suits and discreet communication earpieces stepped smoothly in front of me. Their posture screamed private military, and they moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision. They did not look like standard campus security. They looked like lethal corporate professionals. I froze in my tracks, my grip tightening instinctively around my leather diploma binder. My mind raced, trying to figure out if my brother's shady financial dealings had somehow brought dangerous debt collectors to my doorstep. I took a cautious step back, opening my mouth to shout for help, but before I could utter a single word, a massive vehicle glided silently around the corner. It was a sleek, pitch-black, heavily armored Maybach. It pulled up to the curb right beside me, its pristine paint reflecting the afternoon sun. The engine purred with a deep, menacing hum. The two suited men immediately stepped aside, flanking the rear door like royal guards. The heavy bulletproof door swung open with a solid metallic thud that commanded absolute attention. A man stepped out of the luxurious leather-lined interior. He looked to be in his mid-50s, possessing an aura of absolute unshakable authority. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than my entire decade of doctoral tuition. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp, calculating eyes locked onto me with an intense, intimidating focus. I recognized him instantly. Anyone working in the upper echelons of biotechnology would recognize him. It was Mr. Maxwell, the brilliant, notoriously ruthless chief executive officer of Apex Biogen. His company was a $20 billion global agricultural pharmaceutical conglomerate. Apex Biogen was the undisputed titan of the industry, a corporate predator that bought out promising tech startups, revolutionized global supply chains, and crushed competitors without a second thought. My heart hammered a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. What in the world was a billionaire titan doing standing on a quiet university sidewalk waiting for me? Mr. Maxwell did not offer a polite greeting. He did not ask how my graduation ceremony went, and he certainly did not congratulate me on my degrees. He simply reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a thick, leather-bound dossier, and held it out toward me. I recognized the title printed boldly on the cover. It was my doctoral dissertation. It was the exact same research paper my parents had dismissed as a pathetic joke about treating sick dogs. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice smooth, commanding, and laced with absolute certainty. Dr. Savannah, your research on mutated animal gene therapy is not just a dissertation. It is the key to revolutionizing global agricultural pharmaceuticals. Get in the car. We have an empire to build. I stared at the billionaire titan, then down at the worn leather cover of my dissertation resting in his impeccably manicured hands. A normal person might have hesitated, paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the situation. But I was not a normal person anymore. The desperate daughter who craved her parents' validation had died in the parking lot an hour ago. The woman standing on the curb was a scientist who knew the exact staggering value of her own intellect. I did not ask a single question. I simply gathered the heavy folds of my graduation gown, stepped into the plush leather-lined interior of the armored Maybach, and let the heavy door slam shut behind me. The ride to the Apex Biogen headquarters was a masterclass in corporate efficiency. As the luxury vehicle navigated smoothly through the highway traffic, Mr. Maxwell did not waste time on small talk. He explained that his elite team of data analysts had been aggressively scouring global university databases for months. They were searching for a very specific algorithm related to mutated animal gene therapy, a missing link required to stabilize their newest agricultural pharmaceutical line. My dissertation, the exact same research my father had brutally mocked as a blue-collar joke, was the holy grail Apex Biogen had been desperately hunting for. We arrived at a towering skyscraper entirely encased in reflective black glass. The private executive elevator shot us up 50 floors in a matter of seconds, the doors parting to reveal a breathtaking penthouse boardroom. The space was a fortress of modern corporate power, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the sprawling city skyline. Mr. Maxwell bypassed the standard pleasantries. He took a seat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table, opened a sleek leather folio, and slid a thick stack of legal documents directly across the polished wood until it stopped in front of me. "Read it carefully, Dr. Savannah," he instructed, leaning back in his chair. "But I will save you the trouble of deciphering the legal jargon. We are offering you the position of Chief Scientific Officer at Apex Biogen effective immediately." I opened the heavy cover of the contract. My eyes immediately locked onto the compensation clause printed boldly on the second page. I actually stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The numbers printed on the pristine white paper were so astronomically large, they barely computed in my brain. The contract guaranteed a $5 million sign-on bonus wired directly into my account the moment my pen touched the signature line. Beyond the massive base salary, it also granted me a 2% equity stake in the $20 billion conglomerate. My parents had spent my entire life belittling my career choice, demanding I pay them $15,000 just to justify my existence. Now a billionaire was handing me hundreds of millions of dollars in generational wealth simply for being the smartest person in the room. There is a catch, of course. Mr. Maxwell continued, his sharp eyes tracking my reaction. I am not just hiring you to sit in a pristine laboratory and run genetic sequencing. Apex Biogen is currently in the middle of a massive aggressive expansion phase. We are buying out tech and biotech startups left and right to consolidate our market dominance. However, our mergers and acquisitions department is currently run by financial executives who do not understand the actual science behind the companies they are purchasing. They are buying flashy garbage based on bloated financial projections. He leaned forward, tapping a single finger on the mahogany table. I am giving you absolute veto power over the entire mergers and acquisitions department regarding any biotech or agricultural tech startups. You are the ultimate gatekeeper, Dr. Savannah. No company gets bought, no startup gets a bailout, and no CEO gets a payout unless you personally review their technology and sign your name on the approval form. You have total, unrestricted executive authority. I looked down at the contract. The sheer terrifying magnitude of the power he was handing me was intoxicating. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen resting next to the folio. My hand did not shake. I signed my name with sharp, deliberate strokes, officially binding myself to the Apex Biogen empire. Excellent, Mr. Maxwell said, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face as he collected the signed documents. Let us get straight to work. The M&A department has a massive backlog of desperate startups, practically begging for an Apex buyout. Most of them are running out of capital and facing imminent bankruptcy. I need you to review the top-tier priority files right now and tell me which ones are actually worth our time and which ones we should let burn to the ground. He slid a towering stack of glossy pitch decks and financial dossiers across the table. I took off my doctoral cap, tossed it onto the empty chair beside me, and pulled the first file toward me. I opened the cover, my eyes scanning the executive summary with the clinical, analytical precision I had honed over a decade of rigorous academic research. The first few pitch decks were exactly what Mr. Maxwell had described. Flashy presentations masking weak technology and severely bloated valuations. I tossed them into the rejection pile without a second thought. But as I pulled the fourth thick folder from the center of the stack, my hand suddenly froze, hovering over the glossy cover. The company logo stamped on the front of the pitch deck was incredibly familiar. I opened the file and stared at the executive summary. The financials were an absolute disaster. The startup was hemorrhaging cash at a terrifying rate, taking on massive amounts of toxic debt, and the technology they were trying to sell was entirely fraudulent. The proposal was not a confident business pitch. It was a desperate, panicked plea for a corporate bailout to avoid total financial annihilation and potential federal investigation. My eyes drifted down to the bottom of the page, locking onto the signature of the chief executive officer, begging Apex Biogen for a $50 million lifeline. The company was named Aegis Tech. The CEO was Cameron, my brother, the arrogant golden child who was currently standing on a rented luxury yacht, drinking expensive champagne and celebrating a fake financial victory while my parents cheered him on. He was secretly drowning in debt, and he had absolutely no idea that the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner, holding the power of life and death over his entire fraudulent existence, was the very same sister he had just discarded in a parking lot. I stared at the glossy cover of the Aegis Tech pitch deck, the sheer irony of the universe completely washing over me. My brother was not a tech titan. He was a desperate fraud drowning in a sinking ship, begging the very company I now controlled to throw him a life raft. But the financial numbers in the dossier were too catastrophic to be simple mismanagement. There was active malice hidden in these spreadsheets. I needed the raw, unfiltered truth about exactly how deep Cameron had buried himself before I orchestrated my next move. There was only one person inside his inner circle with the intellect to see through his lies: his wife. I sent a secure encrypted message to Nia, my African-American sister-in-law. Nia was a brilliant forensic accountant who had sacrificed her own rising corporate career to play the role of the perfect supportive tech wife to my brother. While my parents treated me with absolute disdain, Nia had always offered me quiet, unspoken solidarity. Within minutes of receiving my message, she agreed to meet me at a dimly lit, secluded coffee shop on the industrial edge of the city, miles away from the prying eyes of my parents' elite social circles. I arrived early, securing a dark corner booth away from the windows. When Nia walked through the heavy wooden door, my breath caught in my throat. She was entirely stripped of her usual wealthy housewife facade. The pristine designer dresses, the flawless makeup, and the massive diamond rings were completely gone. She wore a simple beige trench coat over an oversized gray sweater. Her eyes carried the heavy, hollow exhaustion of a woman who had not slept peacefully in months. She slid into the booth across from me, glancing nervously over her shoulder before reaching deep into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive, placed it on the scratched wooden table, and slid it directly into my hand. Her fingers were trembling. "You look entirely different," Savannah Nia said, her tired eyes scanning my sharp posture and the quiet confidence radiating from me. "You look like you finally woke up from a terrible nightmare." I slipped the silver drive safely into my bag. "I woke up this morning, Nia. Now I need you to tell me exactly what is on this drive." Nia took a shaky breath, leaning over the table so her voice would not travel past our booth. "It is a complete house of cards, Savannah. Cameron is not just running a failing startup, he is running a massive, highly illegal Ponzi scheme. I started digging into his private accounts last month when the math on our personal taxes stopped making sense. He burned through tens of millions of dollars of investor capital playing the cryptocurrency markets, trying to chase astronomical returns to cover his initial operational losses. When the crypto market crashed, he lost every single penny. He has been paying off his early investors with the capital he raised from his newest funding rounds just to keep the illusion alive. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The yacht party. He was literally popping expensive champagne funded by stolen money while staring down the barrel of a federal investigation. He was accepting the applause of my parents while actively defrauding innocent people. But Nia was not finished. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. "It gets so much worse, Savannah." When he realized the corporate walls were closing in, he panicked. He needed a massive injection of untraceable cash to appease his most aggressive investors before they triggered a federal audit. So he went to Richard and Catherine. "My parents?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "They do not have that kind of liquid cash. They live entirely on credit cards and the illusion of status." "Exactly," Nia replied, her tone laced with absolute disgust. "He manipulated their terrifying obsession with wealth. He convinced them that his company was days away from a $50 million buyout, but claimed he needed a temporary bridge loan to secure the final legal fees and keep the startup afloat until the ink dried. He conned your parents into taking out a second highly predatory mortgage on the family mansion. They leveraged their entire estate to hand him $3 million in cash. And Cameron immediately dumped all of it into the black hole of his corporate debts. The money is entirely gone." My mind raced. My parents had literally bet their home on the golden child. They had handed him $3 million while demanding I pay them $15,000 for raising me. They were completely blind to the fact that their favorite son was a criminal who had just destroyed their entire financial future. But Nia looked terrified for her own safety, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "He is getting desperate, Savannah. He has started forging my signature on personal financial documents to open new credit lines under my name." I am consulting with a divorce attorney and gathering this evidence for the FBI. I refuse to go down for his crimes. He thinks he is untouchable because he believes a massive corporate buyout is going to erase his debts and make him a multimillionaire by the end of the week. Nia leaned closer, the raw terror in her voice unmistakable. He is praying Apex Biogen buys his garbage company to escape federal prison, Nia whispered. He thinks their executives are stupid enough to buy his fake data. As the staggering weight of her words settled between us, my secure phone suddenly vibrated against the wooden table. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark booth. It was a text message from my mother, Catherine. The timing was almost too poetic to be real. I opened the message. It did not contain an apology for missing my graduation. It did not ask how my day went. It simply read, "Emergency family meeting tomorrow at noon. Be there." I looked from the glowing screen to my exhausted, terrified sister-in-law. A slow, dangerous smile curved the edges of my mouth. My parents and my brother had built a fragile glass castle out of lies, theft, and overwhelming arrogance. And tomorrow at noon, I was going straight into the center of it to watch it shatter. The next day, I did not show up to my parents' sprawling Connecticut estate, looking like the exhausted, financially starved graduate student they were so accustomed to bullying. That version of Savannah was dead and buried. Instead, I walked through the heavy wrought iron gates wearing the armor of my new reality. I had purchased a razor-sharp, charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that tailored perfectly to my frame, radiating absolute corporate authority. Resting on my arm was a pristine black leather Hermes bag, a subtle but undeniable symbol of extreme wealth. My posture was straight, my chin held high, and my expression was a mask of cold, impenetrable ice. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion. The interior was exactly as I remembered it. Opulent, aggressively decorated, and suffocatingly pretentious. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, and priceless antique rugs covered the polished hardwood floors. To an outsider, it looked like a fortress of untouchable generational wealth. But thanks to Nia, I knew the terrifying truth. I was standing inside a beautiful hollow shell that was completely leveraged to the bank. I walked into the grand living room. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, demanding attention with every step. My father Richard was pacing back and forth in front of the massive stone fireplace, holding a crystal glass of scotch despite it being barely noon. My brother Cameron was slouched on the custom white leather sofa, nervously bouncing his leg while scrolling through his phone. My mother, Catherine, sat perfectly upright in a high-backed armchair, her face pulled tight with poorly concealed anxiety. When I entered the room, they all stopped and looked at me. A normal family might have been taken aback by the staggering physical transformation of their daughter. They might have wondered how a broke student suddenly acquired tens of thousands of dollars in high-end luxury fashion overnight. But my parents' narcissism was entirely blinding. They only saw what they wanted to see. Catherine let out a sharp, condescending scoff. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a cruel sneer. "Who are you trying to fool with the fake designer clothes, Savannah? Did you max out your pathetic little student credit card just to buy knockoffs and parade around our house? Sit down and shut up. We do not have time for your childish dress-up games today. We have a real family emergency to handle." I did not react to her insult. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not defend the authenticity of my wardrobe. I simply walked over to the single empty armchair across from them, sat down gracefully, and crossed my legs. I placed my Hermes bag deliberately on the glass coffee table between us. "I am sitting, Mother," I said, my voice smooth and entirely devoid of emotion. "Let us hear about this emergency." Richard slammed his glass of scotch down onto the mantel. He marched over to the coffee table and aggressively threw a thick, stapled legal document right next to my bag. It was a commercial loan guarantor agreement. He pointed a shaking finger at the papers, his face flushed with a mixture of alcohol and barely suppressed panic. "Your brother is on the verge of the biggest financial victory this family has ever seen," Richard declared, puffing out his chest to project an illusion of absolute control. He is finalizing a $50 million buyout with a massive corporate conglomerate. The deal is practically done. But due to some ridiculous bureaucratic red tape at his bank, his operational accounts are temporarily frozen. He needs a rapid bridge loan to cover the final legal fees and keep his servers running until the buyout money clears next week. I looked down at the document. The requested loan amount printed on the top page was $500,000. They were asking for $500,000 in liquid cash to cover a massive hole in Cameron's collapsing Ponzi scheme. "And what exactly does this have to do with me?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Richard slammed his hand flat against the glass table, leaning over me to use his physical size as an intimidation tactic. "It has everything to do with you, because you have a completely pristine credit score. We did not pay a single dime for your useless animal degree, which means you have zero outstanding educational debt. Furthermore, you now hold a dual doctorate. Banks love the title doctor. It makes you look incredibly stable on paper. We need you to co-sign this $500,000 loan right now as the primary guarantor." I stared at my father, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his demand. Less than 24 hours ago, he had screamed at me through a phone called my life's work, a pathetic joke, and demanded I pay him $15,000 for the burden of raising me. Now he was ordering me to leverage my flawless financial record to secure $500,000 for the exact same brother who had just secretly mortgaged my parents' home into oblivion. They were trying to use me as a human shield. They wanted me to take on $500,000 of toxic debt so Cameron could keep faking his billionaire lifestyle for a few more days. If the loan defaulted, the bank would immediately seize my assets and garnish my wages, destroying my financial future before it even began. They were entirely willing to sacrifice my life to buy Cameron another week of freedom. I slowly reached out and picked up the loan document. I flipped through the pages, pretending to read the dense legal jargon while my mind calculated the exact angle of my impending strike. Cameron sat on the sofa, a smug, arrogant smile finally breaking through his anxious demeanor. He genuinely believed I was going to cave under our father's aggressive manipulation. He thought I was still the weak, desperate girl who would sign her soul away just to earn a single word of praise from her toxic family. I lowered the document, resting it gently on my lap. I looked directly at Cameron, my eyes locking onto his. I did not scream. I did not throw the papers back in their faces. I was the chief scientific officer of Apex Biogen, and I held the absolute power of life and death over his entire existence. I was going to let him dig his grave just a little bit deeper before I pushed him in. Cameron shifted his weight on the custom white leather sofa, exuding the smug, untouchable aura of a man who firmly believed the entire world revolved around his personal convenience. He lifted his expensive Italian leather loafers and kicked his feet right up onto the pristine glass coffee table, resting them mere inches away from my designer handbag. He crossed his arms behind his head, a sickeningly confident smirk plastered across his face. He looked at me not as a sister, but as a minor annoying obstacle standing between him and his impending fortune. "You really do not get it, Savannah," Cameron chuckled, his voice dripping with heavy, unearned arrogance. "You have been stuck in university laboratories for so long that you simply do not understand how real wealth is generated in the corporate sector. I am not asking for a handout. I am offering you the privilege of being temporarily useful to a future billionaire. I am selling Aegis Tech to Apex Biogen for $50 million. He let the name of the $20 billion conglomerate hang in the air, expecting me to gasp in awe. He waited for my eyes to widen at the sheer magnitude of the $50 million figure. He wanted me to bow down to his manufactured corporate supremacy. "The deal is basically done," Cameron continued, waving his hand dismissively through the air. "Their financial executives have already looked over my pitch decks. They love the valuation. They love the market projections. I have a final mandatory pitch meeting tomorrow morning at their downtown headquarters. I just have to sit down with their newly appointed chief scientific officer to get the final technical approval." Richard crossed his arms, nodding approvingly at his golden child. "Your brother has outsmarted the entire market," Richard added, glaring at me. "He built an empire from scratch. Once Apex Biogen wires that $50 million, he is going to pay off this bridge loan immediately." You will not lose a single dime. You just have to put your name on the paper today. I kept my face completely neutral, though internally my mind was running at light speed. The sheer blinding delusion radiating from Cameron was almost difficult to comprehend. He actually believed his fraudulent spreadsheets and fabricated data would simply sail past the executive review. He thought he could con one of the most ruthless agricultural pharmaceutical conglomerates on the planet just as easily as he had conned our parents out of their home equity. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the armrests of my chair. "And this new chief scientific officer?" I asked, my tone laced with mild, feigned curiosity. "You are confident you can convince them to approve the acquisition?" Cameron let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. He dropped his feet from the table and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking at me like I was the most naive creature on earth. "It is just a formality, Savannah. Some academic lab rat they just promoted to the executive board to make their science division look good for public relations. I deal with these types of people all the time. They are socially awkward number crunchers who get easily blinded by flashy presentations and confident business jargon. I can charm any nerd into signing a contract. I am going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow, give them a 10-minute slideshow on our projected revenue, and walk out with a $50 million buyout." Catherine let out a heavy, dramatic sigh of extreme impatience. She tapped her manicured nails aggressively against the arm of her chair. "We do not have time to explain high-level corporate mergers to someone who spends her days treating animal parasites. The bank closes in 3 hours. Stop asking stupid questions and pick up a pen." Cameron grabbed the loan document from the table and practically shoved it toward me. "Just sign the damn $500,000 loan so I have walking around money until the ink dries, you idiot. Do not ruin this for the family just because you are jealous of my success." The room grew thick with their collective toxic pressure. They were a pack of wolves cornering what they believed was a defenseless, desperate rabbit. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to pick up the pen sign away my flawless credit score and blindly accept the financial noose they were slipping around my neck. I did not reach for the pen. Right at that moment, my parents' housekeeper walked quietly into the grand living room carrying a silver tray. She set a porcelain teapot and a set of delicate cups down on the edge of the glass coffee table before quickly retreating to the kitchen. The timing was absolutely perfect. I slowly reached out and picked up one of the porcelain cups. I poured a small amount of steaming tea, the delicate splashing sound echoing loudly in the sudden tense silence of the room. I lifted the cup to my lips. I did not rush. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat while my family watched me with escalating irritation. Savannah Richard barked, his face turning a dark shade of red. "Did you not hear your brother? Sign the paper." I lowered the teacup, resting it perfectly on its matching saucer, with a soft, definitive clink. I looked directly at Cameron. I let a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of submission. It was the terrifying, calculated smile of an apex predator who had just locked the cage door from the outside. "I am not going to sign your loan, Cameron," I said, my voice smooth and entirely devoid of hesitation. Before the eruption of their outrage could even begin to form, I tilted my head slightly, my eyes piercing straight through his arrogant facade. I simply asked a single question. "Are you absolutely certain this new CSO will approve the buyout for your garbage company?" Cameron stared at me for a split second, his brain entirely misinterpreting the weight of my question. He thought I was just being a bitter, jealous sibling trying to poke holes in his magnificent corporate fantasy. He rolled his eyes, letting out a loud theatrical groan of annoyance that echoed in the cavernous living room. "Garbage company," Cameron mocked, shaking his head with a pitying smirk. "You are so unbelievably pathetic, Savannah. You have zero understanding of the modern tech industry. Aegis Tech is going to revolutionize the global market, and Apex Biogen knows it. That is exactly why they are throwing $50 million at me. You are just terrified that my massive success is going to completely overshadow your pathetic little animal clinic." Before I could even offer a calm response to his staggering delusion, the fragile, paper-thin patience of my mother entirely snapped. Catherine slammed her hand flat against the glass coffee table with such explosive, violent force that the porcelain teacups rattled sharply against their saucers. She leaned forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The polished, aristocratic facade she so carefully maintained for her elite country club friends completely melted away, revealing the vicious, highly toxic woman hiding underneath. "How dare you speak to your brother like that?" Catherine shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings of the mansion. "He is generously offering you a chance to finally be useful to this family, and you sit there giving us your insolent, ungrateful attitude. You are a complete embarrassment. We should have never let you pursue that useless science degree in the first place." I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on my lap, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she was desperately trying to provoke. "I am simply looking out for my own financial security, Mother. I am not co-signing a $500,000 loan for a company I know absolutely nothing about." "You know nothing about anything," Catherine spat, pointing a manicured, trembling finger directly at my face. "Your pathetic animal doctor job will not make $500,000 in a lifetime. You play with sick dogs and cats while your brother is out here dealing with global conglomerates and venture capitalists. You are a financial parasite. We fed you, we clothed you, and we housed you for 18 long years. You owe us everything. Pay us back for raising you. Sign the damn paper right now, or I swear to God, I will publicly disown you. I will call every single family friend and tell them what a selfish, ungrateful failure you turned out to be. We will erase you from this family entirely." The threat hung heavy and suffocating in the opulent living room. Disownment, public humiliation, social exile. For my entire life, those were the ultimate terrifying weapons my parents wielded to keep me in line. They relied heavily on my desperate childhood need for their love and approval to manipulate my every move. They truly believed that the sheer terror of losing my family would force me to blindly sign away my financial future and take on $500,000 of toxic debt. Richard crossed his arms, standing tall next to the grand stone fireplace, nodding in firm agreement with my mother. "You heard her, Savannah. This is your absolute last warning. You either pick up that pen and support your brother, or you walk out that front door right now and never come back." I looked at the three of them. My father, the arrogant enforcer who worshipped money above his own daughter. My mother, the toxic manipulator who viewed children as financial investments. And my brother, the fraudulent golden child, who was currently hiding a $3 million mortgage default from the very parents fiercely defending him. They were a perfect destructive trinity of deception. A profound, unbreakable sense of peace washed over my entire soul. The little girl who used to cry alone in her bedroom, wondering why she was never good enough for her parents, was finally and permanently gone. The woman sitting in the tailored Tom Ford suit did not need their conditional love. I had a $5 million sign-on bonus sitting securely in my bank account. I held a 2% equity stake in a $20 billion empire. And most importantly, I possessed the absolute executive power to destroy the exact company my family was currently worshiping as their savior. I did not argue. I did not yell. I did not waste a single breath trying to explain my worth to people who were fiercely committed to misunderstanding me. I smoothly pushed my chair back and stood up. The movement was so graceful, so entirely devoid of the panicked submission they expected that it caught them completely off guard. I reached down and picked up my pristine black Hermes bag from the glass table. I opened the gold clasp, reached inside, and pulled out my sleek leather wallet. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, his voice faltering slightly, as his primary intimidation tactic failed to produce the desired result. "I told you to sign the paper." I ignored him entirely. I pulled a crisp, newly minted $100 bill from my wallet. I held it between my fingers for a brief moment, letting the green paper catch the light of the massive crystal chandelier above us. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I let the bill drop. It fluttered gracefully through the tense air and landed softly right on top of the stapled loan guarantor document. Catherine stared at the money, her mouth opening and closing in sheer bewildered shock. "What is this?" she stammered, entirely unable to process the absolute financial disrespect. For the tea, I said, my voice projecting a cold, untouchable authority that commanded the massive living room. It was quite refreshing. I turned my gaze to Cameron. He was staring at me, a flicker of genuine, unsettling confusion finally breaking through his arrogant smirk. He did not understand how I could possibly be so unbothered by the threat of total family exile. He did not understand the quiet, lethal confidence radiating from my every single move. I wish you the best of luck with your pitch tomorrow at Apex Biogen. Cameron, I stated softly, my eyes locking onto his with predatory focus. I have a feeling it is going to be an incredibly memorable meeting. I did not wait for his response. I turned on my heel, the sharp click of my stilettos sounding like a ticking metronome as I walked confidently across the polished marble floor. I headed straight for the heavy mahogany front doors, leaving the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of my childhood home behind me forever. As my hand grasped the cool metal of the door handle, the brief, stunned silence in the living room abruptly shattered. Cameron burst into a loud, obnoxious fit of mocking laughter. "Let her go!" Cameron yelled, his voice carrying clearly down the grand hallway, completely dripping with false bravado. "Let her go back to her pathetic little clinic. We do not need her. By tomorrow afternoon, I am going to be a multimillionaire tech titan, and she is going to be begging us for a handout. Do not answer her calls when she realizes what she just walked away from." I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the crisp, sunlit afternoon. I walked down the sweeping driveway toward my waiting private driver, Cameron's delusional laughter still echoing faintly behind me. He was utterly convinced he held the winning hand. He was entirely certain that tomorrow morning would bring him limitless wealth, corporate glory, and total vindication. He had absolutely no idea that the executioner's block was already rigged. The blade was freshly sharpened, and my hand was the only one resting firmly on the release lever. The heavy doors of the armored Maybach sealed me inside a vault of quiet luxury, cutting off the faint, pathetic sound of my brother's delusional laughter. My private driver navigated smoothly away from the sprawling Connecticut estate and merged onto the highway, heading straight back to the towering black glass headquarters of Apex Biogen. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for walking away from my parents. The emotional umbilical cord was permanently severed. My mind was entirely focused on the impending corporate execution. When I stepped out of the private executive elevator onto the 50th floor, the atmosphere of the penthouse boardroom was electric with high-stakes corporate energy. Mr. Maxwell was already waiting for me. He stood by the massive digital smartboard, holding a sleek tablet. He had granted me absolute veto power over the mergers and acquisitions department, but as a seasoned billionaire titan, he was deeply invested in watching how his new chief scientific officer handled a hostile threat. I walked over to the mahogany conference table, opened my designer bag, and pulled out the encrypted USB drive Nia had given me at the coffee shop. I handed it directly to Apex Biogen's lead data analyst, who was standing quietly in the corner of the room. Within seconds, the contents of the drive were projected onto the massive digital screen. The sheer scale of Cameron's financial crimes illuminated the dark boardroom in stark, undeniable high definition. Mr. Maxwell crossed his arms, his sharp eyes scanning the fabricated revenue streams, the hidden crypto losses, and the highly illegal shell accounts Cameron had used to hide his massive operational deficits. "This is not just a bad investment," Mr. Maxwell observed, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "This is textbook wire fraud. Your brother is running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He is pitching us a $50 million acquisition based entirely on fabricated intellectual property and stolen investor capital. If our standard financial executives had blindly approved this buyout without your scientific review, Apex Biogen would have inherited a massive federal liability." I nodded, pulling up the specific technical schematics Cameron had included in his Aegis Tech pitch deck. "The science he is claiming to possess does not even exist," I explained, pointing to a glaring flaw in his genetic data projections. He copied publicly available research, altered the variables, and slapped his corporate logo on it. "It is entirely fraudulent. He is trying to sell us a multi-million-dollar empty box." Right at that moment, my secure phone chimed with an incoming encrypted email. I unlocked the screen. It was a secondary data package from Nia. The subject line simply read "The Final Nail." I opened the attached files and felt a fresh wave of disgust wash over me. The documents were high-resolution scans of Nia's personal banking records, joint investment portfolios, and private trust funds. Cameron had not just drained his company and leveraged my parents' mansion. He had systematically raided his own wife's financial safety net. He had expertly forged Nia's signature on multiple high-interest credit lines, draining hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover his rapidly accelerating margin calls in the crypto market. He had stolen her entire future to fund his arrogant charade. But Nia was not a victim who would go down quietly with the ship. Attached to the financial records was a brief, fiercely determined message. The divorce papers are officially signed and filed with the county clerk, Nia wrote. I have also handed this exact data packet over to a contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am officially turning state's evidence Savannah. I am taking him down and I am securing full immunity. Good luck tomorrow. Burn him to the ground. I looked up from the screen, a profound sense of respect for my sister-in-law settling into my chest. The two women who had been treated as secondary disposable assets by my toxic family were now holding the matches that would completely incinerate their fraudulent empire. I forwarded the entire evidence packet to Mr. Maxwell's secure tablet. He reviewed the forged signatures and the FBI notification. A slow, predatory smile crossed his face. He looked at me with an expression of absolute, unshakable professional respect. Your brother thinks he is walking into a routine corporate pitch tomorrow morning, Mr. Maxwell said. He thinks he is going to charm a naive scientist and walk out with $50 million. How exactly do you want to handle this execution, Dr. Savannah? I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the glittering city lights, beginning to illuminate the sprawling metropolis below. I do not just want to reject his proposal. I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calibrated for the impending destruction. If we simply send him a rejection letter, he will scramble. He will try to find another vulnerable buyer. I want to shatter his reality face to face. I want him to stand in this exact boardroom at the absolute height of his manufactured arrogance and watch the floor collapse beneath his feet. I want the rejection to be completely undeniable. Mr. Maxwell nodded in firm agreement. The boardroom is yours tomorrow, Chief Scientific Officer. I will have our corporate legal team on standby in the adjacent office just in case he decides to make a scene. I spent the rest of the evening preparing the exact sequence of events. I did not sleep. I felt no exhaustion, only the pure, adrenaline-fueled clarity of a woman about to reclaim her entire narrative. The next morning arrived with a crisp, blinding sunlight that pierced through the glass walls of the 50th floor boardroom. The trap was set. The digital projectors were loaded with the fraudulent data perfectly masked behind a standard corporate welcome screen. I sat in the primary executive leather chair at the head of the massive mahogany table. I wore my tailored Tom Ford suit, a physical manifestation of the power I now wielded. I picked up a solid gold fountain pen and spun it casually between my fingers, waiting in the pristine silence of the corporate fortress. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Cameron strutted into the room. He wore a custom-tailored Italian suit, his hair perfectly styled, holding a sleek leather briefcase that contained the lies he believed would make him a billionaire. He exuded a sickening, toxic overconfidence, flashing a bright, aggressively smug smile toward the center of the room. He was entirely ready to charm the new executive, completely unaware that he had just walked directly into the jaws of a predator he created. Cameron closed the heavy glass doors behind him with a confident push, adjusting the cuffs of his custom Italian suit. He took a deep, steadying breath, puffing out his chest to project the ultimate image of a visionary tech founder. He marched toward the front of the room, keeping his eyes entirely focused on the massive digital smartboard to ensure his carefully fabricated slideshow was ready to deploy. He dropped his leather briefcase onto the mahogany table with a loud, authoritative thud. It was the calculated, arrogant move of a man attempting to establish immediate dominance in a room he did not own. He was completely focused on the illusion he was selling, entirely oblivious to the reality waiting for him at the end of the table. Finally, he turned his gaze toward the primary executive chair to greet his supposedly naive, easily manipulated target. His confident, blinding smile was fully prepared. But the exact moment his eyes locked onto the person sitting at the head of the table, that smile violently shattered. Cameron physically froze, his entire body locked up as if he had just slammed into an invisible brick wall at highway speed. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. I did not move. I remained perfectly reclined in the plush leather chair, my posture relaxed, but radiating absolute, undeniable authority. I wore the sharp Tom Ford suit he had mocked yesterday. I continued to casually spin the solid gold fountain pen between my fingers, letting the rhythmic metallic glint catch the bright morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched the gears in his brain violently grind to a halt. His eyes darted wildly around the massive, intimidating penthouse boardroom, taking in the 50-story view, and the sheer corporate power of the space then snapped back to my face. He was entirely unable to reconcile the two images. In his desperately flawed reality, I was the broke, pathetic animal doctor who had just been thrown out of his parents' mansion. I was the financial parasite who stupidly refused to sign a loan to save his life. I had absolutely no business being anywhere near the executive floor of the Apex Biogen headquarters. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a logical explanation for my presence. Since his narcissistic ego refused to accept that I could possibly possess any real power, his brain instantly defaulted to the only scenario that made sense to him. He convinced himself that I had stalked him. He assumed I had tracked his location, somehow bypassed the biometric security scanners in the lobby, and sneaked into this highly classified executive boardroom just to throw a petty jealous tantrum and sabotage his massive payout. Alternatively, he thought perhaps I had begged for a miserable temp job pouring coffee or organizing files just to be near the corporate elite. The shock rapidly morphed into intense defensive rage. Cameron slammed his hands down on the mahogany table, leaning forward with a vicious sneer. "What the hell are you doing here?" he exploded, his voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. His carefully crafted corporate persona completely evaporated, replaced instantly by the toxic bully I had known my entire life. "How did you even get past the front desk? Did you follow me here just to play some kind of sick joke? Are you actually this psychotic?" I stopped spinning the gold pen. I placed it gently on the table, resting my hands together, and looked at him with an expression of pure, unbothered ice. I did not say a single word. My total, deafening silence only infuriated him further. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger directly at my face, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead as his panic began to spike. "Get out of that chair right now, Savannah," he commanded, his voice pitching higher with manic desperation. "You are not going to embarrass me today. You are not going to throw a jealous fit because I am about to become a multimillionaire while you play with sick dogs. I am pitching a $50 million acquisition to the chief scientific officer of this entire conglomerate in exactly 2 minutes. If they walk in here and see you sitting in their seat, my deal is completely ruined." He took a threatening step forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "Get out before I call security and have you arrested for trespassing. Are you trying to ruin my billion-dollar meeting? I swear to God I will call Mom and Dad right now and tell them you tried to destroy my company. They will make sure you never show your face in our town again." He reached into his pocket, frantically pulling out his smartphone, completely ready to dial the building guards and have me physically dragged out of the room. He genuinely believed he possessed the authority to banish me from my own fortress. He thought he was the king of the castle, entirely blind to the fact that he was standing on a trapdoor I had personally installed. Before his thumb could even press the dial button, the heavy glass doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. The sound was smooth, but in the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the room, it felt like an explosive thunderclap. Cameron instantly whipped around. He shoved his phone back into his pocket and desperately attempted to smooth his panicked features back into the charming visionary CEO he was supposed to be playing. He plastered on a wide, welcoming smile, straightening his tie, entirely prepared to greet the executive who held his financial salvation. Mr. Maxwell, the billionaire titan and undisputed ruler of the Apex Biogen empire, stepped into the room. He walked with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator inspecting his territory. Cameron immediately stepped forward, extending his right hand, his mouth opening to deliver his heavily rehearsed opening pitch. Mr. Maxwell completely ignored the outstretched hand. He walked right past Cameron as if my brother were nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture blocking his path. He approached the head of the table where I was sitting. To Cameron's absolute mind, bending horror, the billionaire titan stopped, stood at rigid attention and bowed his head respectfully toward me. Dr. Savannah, Mr. Maxwell, said, his deep, commanding voice carrying perfectly across the silent room. The Aegis Tech acquisition file is on your desk. The final decision is entirely yours. Cameron stood absolutely paralyzed, his outstretched hand still suspended in the air, waiting for a handshake that would never come, began to tremble violently. The air was violently sucked out of the penthouse boardroom. The reality of Mr. Maxwell's words crashed into his brain like a freight train. His eyes darted from the billionaire CEO to me sitting flawlessly in the primary executive chair. The structural integrity of his entire fabricated billionaire persona instantly evaporated. His legs gave out entirely. He could not support his own weight. He desperately clawed at the edge of the mahogany conference table to stop himself from hitting the floor, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping against the polished marble. He collapsed heavily into one of the guest chairs, his chest heaving as he gasped for oxygen that suddenly felt entirely toxic. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. I did not offer him a glass of water. I did not offer him a single ounce of sibling sympathy. I simply let the suffocating, terrifying silence stretch across the room, forcing him to drown in the magnitude of his own catastrophic failure. I reached across the table and picked up the glossy, heavy pitch deck for Aegis Tech. I held it up, letting the bright morning sunlight reflect off his fraudulent corporate logo. I looked at it with sheer, undisguised disgust. Then I let it drop. The thick dossier hit the solid wood table with a loud, echoing smack. The sharp sound jolted Cameron out of his stupor. He flinched violently, his red-rimmed eyes snapping up to meet my cold, predatory gaze. "You were right, Cameron," I said, my voice smooth, perfectly calibrated and slicing through the quiet room like a scalpel. "Veterinary biotechnology is a joke. But that joke just earned me $5 million in cash and absolute veto power over your destiny. As the Chief Scientific Officer of Apex Biogen, I am officially denying the acquisition of your fraudulent company." "No." Cameron gasped the word, tearing out of his throat in a high, pathetic wheeze. "No, this cannot be happening. This is a prank. This is some kind of sick, elaborate loyalty test." He desperately turned his head toward Mr. Maxwell, who was standing quietly by the digital smartboard with his arms crossed. "Mr. Maxwell, sir, you cannot let her do this. She is my sister. She holds a personal grudge against me because my parents favor my success. She is completely unqualified to evaluate a tech acquisition of this magnitude. You are making a $50 million mistake by letting an animal doctor review my intellectual property." Mr. Maxwell did not even blink. He looked down at Cameron with the exact same expression one might use when observing an insect crawling across a pristine floor. "Dr. Savannah possesses a dual doctorate and a level of scientific intellect you could not possibly comprehend," Mr. Maxwell replied, his tone laced with absolute 0 degrees of mercy. "Furthermore, she is the ultimate gatekeeper for this conglomerate. I do not override my chief scientific officer. If she says your company is fraudulent, then your company is fraudulent. I suggest you stop embarrassing yourself and listen to her." Cameron whipped his head back toward me. The blinding panic in his eyes was finally giving way to raw, unadulterated terror. He realized there was no higher authority to appeal to. I was the Supreme Court, and I had just handed down a death sentence. I opened his pitch deck, turning the glossy pages with agonizing slowness. "Let us discuss this $50 million mistake, Cameron." I pointed to a brightly colored graph projecting massive revenue growth. You claim your new genetic sequencing algorithm will cut agricultural diagnostic times in half. But the technical schematics you submitted in Appendix B are entirely fabricated. You lifted the core code from a public domain database from 2 years ago, scrambled the variables, and slapped the Aegis Tech logo on it. It is scientifically impossible. You are trying to sell a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate an empty, worthless box. A thick bead of sweat rolled down Cameron's temple. He opened his mouth to defend his fake science, but I did not let him speak. And it gets worse, I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I flipped to the financial section of his dossier. I know exactly why you are trying to sell an empty box. I know about the margin calls, Cameron. I know about the tens of millions of dollars of investor capital you burned in the cryptocurrency markets. I know you have been paying off your early investors with your new funding rounds to keep the Ponzi scheme alive. Cameron physically shrank into his chair. He clutched his stomach as if I had just stabbed him. How he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. How do you know that? I ignored his question and pressed the blade in deeper. That is why you were so incredibly desperate to force me to co-sign that $500,000 bridge loan yesterday. You were entirely out of stolen cash. You needed my pristine credit score to keep the lights on for just a few more days, hoping you could con Apex Biogen into wiring you $50 million before the federal auditors knocked on your door. You were perfectly willing to destroy my entire financial future just to buy yourself a temporary shield. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto his terrified, sweating face. And I also know about the $3 million mortgage you manipulated our parents into taking out on the family mansion. You took their home, you dumped the cash into your black hole of debt, and now they are entirely leveraged to the bank. Cameron was hyperventilating now. Short, rapid, desperate breaths escaped his pale lips. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his custom Italian suit suddenly looking like an oversized Halloween costume on a frightened child. He was completely trapped. The corporate bailout was dead. The bridge loan was denied. His secret crimes were entirely exposed in the highest echelon of the industry he worshipped. But the execution was not over. The sheer devastation of the rejected buyout was only the first phase of the trap. Cameron thought the loss of the $50 million was the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to him today. He had absolutely no idea that the real architect of his destruction was waiting just outside the boardroom doors, holding the final inescapable federal nail to his coffin. Cameron stared at me, the terrifying reality of his complete exposure finally breaking the last fragile threads of his sanity. The arrogant, untouchable tech CEO vanished, entirely replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. His breathing became incredibly erratic, his chest heaving as if the oxygen in the room had suddenly turned to liquid glass. He could not maintain eye contact with me, nor could he look at the billionaire titan standing silently by the digital board. He physically slid off the expensive leather guest chair. His knees hit the plush carpet of the penthouse boardroom with a dull thud. He did not stand back up. Instead, he crawled. The golden child of our family. The man who had spent my entire life looking down on me from a manufactured pedestal was literally crawling across the floor toward my side of the massive mahogany table. He gripped the polished edge of the wood with white trembling knuckles, pulling himself up just enough to look me in the eyes. "Savannah, please!" Cameron begged, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic sob. "You cannot do this to me. You have to sign the acquisition paperwork. You have to approve the deal. If you reject this buyout, I am completely finished. I am going to federal prison." Tears began to stream freely down his pale face, ruining his perfectly manicured appearance. He was no longer trying to hide his crimes. The sheer terror of his impending reality forced a chaotic, frantic confession right out of his throat. "The people I took money from, Savannah, they are not just standard venture capitalists," he babbled uncontrollably. "Some of them are incredibly dangerous institutional investors. They are demanding their quarterly returns by the end of the week. If I do not wire them that $50 million Apex buyout, they are going to trigger a massive audit. The Securities and Exchange Commission will step in. The FBI will seize my servers. I will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. You have to save me. I am your brother. You cannot just sit there and watch me burn. I looked down at him, my expression completely devoid of mercy. You want me to commit massive corporate fraud, approve the purchase of a worthless company, and steal $50 million from my employer just to cover up your illegal Ponzi scheme, I summarized coldly. You want me to risk my own freedom to save the exact same brother who laughed in my face yesterday when I walked out of our parents' house. Before Cameron could open his mouth to offer another pathetic sniveling excuse, the heavy glass doors at the back of the boardroom swung open for a second time. The sharp, authoritative click of high heels echoed against the polished floorboards. Cameron frantically snapped his head around, his tear-filled eyes widening in absolute shock. Nia stepped into the room. She looked nothing like the exhausted, terrified woman I had met at the dimly lit coffee shop. She was radiant, fierce, and entirely empowered. She wore a tailored crimson-red business suit that projected absolute confidence. Flanking her on either side were three men in dark suits carrying thick leather briefcases. They were Apex Biogen's elite corporate legal team, the absolute best defense attorneys money could buy, and they were walking entirely in step with my sister-in-law. Cameron stared at his wife, completely bewildered. In his twisted, narcissistic mind, Naya was simply an obedient accessory, a quiet housewife who existed solely to support his chaotic ambitions. He had absolutely no idea she possessed the intellect and the sheer willpower to orchestrate his downfall. "Nia, honey," Cameron gasped, reaching a trembling hand out toward her. "What are you doing here?" "Tell her. Tell Savannah she has to sign the deal. We are going to lose everything if she does not sign the paper." Nia did not rush to his side. She did not offer him a comforting embrace. She walked right up to the mahogany table, looking down at the miserable man kneeling on the floor. Her face was a mask of cold, calculated vengeance. She reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a massive, heavy stack of bound legal documents. "I am not here to save you, Cameron," Nia stated, her deep voice ringing with total, unshakable authority. "I am here to bury you." With a swift, aggressive motion, Nia threw the heavy stack of documents directly into his chest. The thick binders hit him with a loud thwack before exploding outward, scattering hundreds of pages of forensic accounting records, bank statements, and legal filings all over the plush carpet surrounding him. Cameron recoiled, staring blankly at the papers raining down on him. "What is this?" he stammered, his eyes darting frantically across the scattered spreadsheets. "Those are the signed divorce papers," Nia declared, her voice slicing through the room with lethal precision. "But that is the least of your problems today. You aren't just going to prison for defrauding investors, Cameron. The FBI already has the files proving you forged my signature." Cameron physically flinched, a sickening gasp escaping his lips. He looked at the printed scans of his forged credit applications lying on the floor. "You thought I was just a stupid, blind housewife," Nia continued, stepping closer so he could feel the full weight of her fury. "You forgot that I am a forensic accountant. I tracked every single penny you stole from my personal trust funds. I tracked the illegal transfers you made to cover your crypto margin calls. I compiled every single piece of fraudulent data, every fake ledger, and every illegal wire transfer, and I handed the entire package directly to a federal investigator at dawn this morning." Cameron violently shook his head, pressing his hands over his ears, as if trying to block out the sound of his own destruction. "No, Nia. Please, you cannot turn state's evidence against your own husband. They will lock me away forever." "I secured full unconditional legal immunity for myself," Nia replied, crossing her arms over her chest. "And in exchange I handed them the exact map they need to dismantle your entire fraudulent life. You stole my future, Cameron. Now I am taking yours." The boardroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The absolute totality of his ruin was finally complete. The massive corporate buyout was dead. His marriage was entirely over. The federal authorities already possessed the irrefutable evidence required to put him behind bars for decades. He had absolutely nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide, and no one left to manipulate. Then, cutting through the dead silence of the room, a sharp, frantic vibration echoed from Cameron's jacket pocket. He jumped, his hands shaking violently as he fumbled to pull out his smartphone. The screen illuminated brightly, displaying the incoming caller ID. It was not his parents. It was not an investor. The name flashing aggressively on the screen belonged to the wealth management division of his primary lending bank. The automated financial triggers had finally been tripped. The massive catastrophic defaults hidden in his accounts had triggered a systemic alarm. They were calling to officially call in all his outstanding loans, freeze every single one of his personal and corporate assets, and lock him entirely out of his own bank accounts. The illusion was officially over. The phone continued to vibrate violently against the plush carpet, the harsh buzzing sound acting as the final undeniable death knell for Cameron's fabricated empire. He stared at the glowing screen as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He did not answer it. He did not need to. He already knew exactly what the automated voice on the other end of the line was going to say. The risk management algorithms at his primary lending bank had officially frozen his accounts. Every single elite credit card inside his custom leather wallet was now a useless piece of plastic. His corporate checking accounts, his personal savings, and his hidden offshore safety nets were entirely locked down by federal banking mandates. In the span of a few excruciating minutes, the golden child of our family was officially worth absolute zero. He slowly lifted his head, his face a grotesque mask of sheer, unadulterated desperation. He looked at me sitting comfortably in the primary executive chair, and then at Nia, who was staring down at him with an expression of immovable, icy stone. "Savannah," he whispered, his voice completely devoid of the booming, arrogant bravado he had wielded like a weapon his entire life. "I will do anything. I will sign over the entire company to you for free. I will give you every single patent I own. I will mop the floors of your laboratories. Just do not let them send me to prison. Please, you are my sister, you have to protect me." I looked down at him, feeling a profound, deeply satisfying sense of closure. The man kneeling on the floor was the exact same person who had spent 33 years actively trying to destroy my self-worth. He was the brother who had laughed uncontrollably as I walked out of my parents' mansion yesterday, utterly convinced I was a pathetic failure who would soon be begging him for a handout. The universe has a beautiful, poetic way of balancing the scales, and I was entirely ready to deliver the final weight. "I am not your protector, Cameron," I replied, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. "And I certainly do not hire federal criminals to mop the floors of my laboratories. Your pitch is officially over." I reached out and pressed my index finger firmly against the glowing silver intercom button embedded in the polished mahogany table. The line connected instantly to the ground floor security hub. "This is the chief scientific officer," I stated clearly into the microphone. "We have an unauthorized trespasser in the penthouse boardroom. Send an extraction team immediately. He is to be escorted off the premises and permanently banned from all Apex Biogen properties." Cameron let out a strangled, hysterical cry. "No, wait, let us negotiate. Mr. Maxwell, sir, you are a businessman. You know we can make a deal." He scrambled on his knees toward the billionaire CEO, his hands reaching out desperately to grab the hem of Maxwell's bespoke charcoal jacket. Mr. Maxwell simply took a single fluid step back, his face a mask of total corporate disgust. "Do not touch me," Mr. Maxwell ordered sharply, his voice practically vibrating with authority. "Your company is a fraud, your financials are an insult to my intelligence, and your presence in my boardroom is a severe corporate liability. You have exactly 10 seconds to leave before my guards use physical force." The heavy glass doors swung open before Cameron could even attempt to stand. 4 massive security guards poured into the boardroom. They wore tactical black uniforms and moved with the terrifying synchronized precision of a highly trained corporate military unit. They did not ask him to leave politely. They did not care about his custom-tailored Italian suit, his expensive leather briefcase, or his fabricated tech founder persona. They immediately descended upon him. 2 of the guards grabbed Cameron by the arms, hoisting him violently off the plush carpet. Cameron thrashed and kicked his expensive loafers, scrambling uselessly in the air. "Let go of me!" he screamed, his voice cracking hysterically. "I am a tech founder. I am a CEO. You cannot touch me. Do you know who I am?" The guards ignored his pathetic protests entirely. They dragged him backward out of the boardroom. I stood up from my chair and walked slowly to the glass doorway alongside Nia. We stood side by side, watching the golden child being hauled down the pristine, brightly lit executive corridor. Dozens of elite corporate executives, financial analysts, and legal partners stepped out of their glass offices to watch the spectacle. The high society tech genius was reduced to a sobbing, kicking toddler, being physically removed from the absolute epicenter of global power. He was dragged into the executive elevator, the polished steel doors sliding shut on his terrified, tear-streaked face, cutting off his frantic screaming. I knew exactly what awaited him at the bottom. He would be paraded through the massive, crowded glass lobby of the Apex Biogen headquarters. Hundreds of employees and visiting executives would watch him being marched out. The humiliation would be absolute, public, and entirely inescapable. Every single person in the agricultural pharmaceutical industry would know by lunchtime that Cameron was a blacklisted fraud. I walked back to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse boardroom and looked down at the street 50 stories below. A few moments later, the heavy glass doors of the main lobby burst open. The security guards literally tossed Cameron out onto the hard concrete pavement. He sprawled onto the sidewalk, his custom suit wrinkled and ruined, his leather briefcase tossed carelessly beside him. He slowly pushed himself up onto his knees, looking completely broken, entirely stripped of his dignity, his wealth, and his billionaire delusions. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I did not need to be down there to know it was still ringing with the relentless, aggressive demands of the federal banking authorities. He was stranded on the street, with absolutely nothing, staring up at the towering black glass fortress he had tried to conquer. Nia stepped up to the window beside me, looking down at the tiny, miserable figure on the pavement. "It is finally over," she breathed, a profound wave of relief washing over her face, making her look years younger. I smiled, turning my gaze away from the street and looking out across the sprawling city skyline. "It is over for him," I corrected softly. "But the financial shockwave is just beginning. By tomorrow morning, the bank is going to foreclose on my parents' mansion. They are going to wake up and realize their golden child just destroyed their entire lives. And when they hit absolute rock bottom, they are only going to have one place left to turn." The corporate execution of Cameron was not a quiet affair. In the cutthroat world of agricultural biotechnology, blood in the water attracts immediate media attention. Less than 48 hours after my brother was physically tossed onto the concrete pavement, his entire fraudulent empire imploded. The federal authorities raided the Aegis tech offices, seizing servers and freezing every single operational account. The financial fallout was spectacular, but it was quickly overshadowed by the announcement of Apex Biogen's newest executive appointment. By the end of the week, my face was plastered across the digital and print cover of Forbes magazine. The headline was printed in bold, undeniable gold lettering: "The $20 billion prodigy." The article detailed my dual doctorate, my groundbreaking research on mutated animal gene therapy, and the unprecedented $5 million sign-on bonus Mr. Maxwell had personally authorized to secure my talents. I was no longer the invisible, discarded daughter playing with sick dogs. I was officially corporate royalty. I knew exactly what would happen the second that magazine hit the newsstands in my parents' affluent Connecticut suburb. It took exactly 4 days for their manufactured reality to completely shatter. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I was sitting in my penthouse office reviewing international acquisition portfolios when the security intercom on my desk chimed. The head of lobby security sounded unusually hesitant. He informed me that 2 individuals claiming to be my parents were currently standing at the front desk, refusing to leave without seeing me. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy blue suit, and took the private executive elevator down to the ground floor. The main lobby of Apex Biogen was a massive, intimidating cavern of black marble and towering glass pillars. It was designed specifically to make visitors feel incredibly small. Standing in the exact center of this imposing space were Richard and Catherine. They looked entirely out of place. The sheer arrogance that usually radiated from their every movement had been completely stripped away, replaced by an aura of frantic, suffocating desperation. They were holding the most obnoxious, massive floral arrangements I had ever seen. Towering displays of white orchids and rare imported roses that reeked of absolute panic. When the silver doors of the executive elevator slid open and I stepped out, their heads snapped in my direction. The pivot was so immediate, so entirely sickening, that it belonged in a psychological textbook. Catherine practically dropped her massive bouquet of orchids on the polished marble floor. She sprinted across the lobby toward me, her arms outstretched, a mask of desperate, artificial maternal love plastered across her face. "Savannah, my beautiful girl," Catherine cried out, her voice echoing loudly and drawing the confused stares of several passing corporate analysts. She attempted to pull me into a tight embrace, but I took a single fluid step backward, crossing my arms over my chest. My physical rejection forced her to stop dead in her tracks. She did not miss a beat. She immediately transitioned into theatrical heavy sobbing, producing entirely fake tears that threatened to ruin her expensive makeup. "We always knew you were our most brilliant child," Catherine wept, clutching her hands together in a pathetic display of pleading. "We saw the Forbes cover. We are so incredibly proud of you. You have brought so much honor to this family. I always told your father that your scientific mind was going to change the world." I stared at her, feeling a profound physical wave of nausea. This was the exact same woman who just a few days ago had slammed her hand on a glass table, called me a financial parasite, and threatened to publicly disown me for refusing to sign a $500,000 loan. Her hypocrisy was not just shameless, it was entirely limitless. Richard stepped up beside her. He looked completely haggard. The aggressive, domineering patriarch who worshipped Wall Street was gone. His face was pale, his shoulders were slumped, and his hands were trembling slightly as he held his own ridiculous bouquet of roses. "Savannah, you have to listen to us," Richard pleaded, his voice completely stripped of its usual booming authority. "Your brother lied to us. Cameron scammed us completely. He told us his company was worth $50 million. He manipulated us into taking out a $3 million second mortgage on the family mansion to cover his legal fees." Catherine let out a loud, dramatic wail, grabbing the sleeve of my suit jacket. I firmly pulled my arm away, stepping further out of her reach. "The federal agents arrested him yesterday morning," Catherine babbled, her voice pitching higher with raw panic. "They dragged him out of his apartment in handcuffs. His accounts are entirely frozen. He lost every single penny we gave him. Savannah, the bank called us this morning. Because Cameron defaulted on the bridge loan they are calling in our mortgage. They are foreclosing on the mansion. We are going to lose our home. We are going to lose our country club memberships. We will be absolutely ruined in front of all our friends. Please save us." Richard took a desperate step forward. "You are the only one who can fix this. You have the $5 million bonus. You have the executive salary. Please, Savannah, you have to save us. You have to pay off the bank before they evict us. We are your family." They stood there in the towering glass lobby, completely stripped of their power, begging the very daughter they had discarded like garbage to act as their financial savior. They expected me to fall back into my old role. They expected the desperate approval-seeking child inside me to finally cave, to hand over millions of dollars just to purchase the parental love they were currently faking. I looked at them. I did not yell. I did not throw their vicious insults back in their faces. My expression remained a mask of absolute impenetrable ice. The security guards stationed at the front desk were watching me closely, their hands resting near their tactical belts, entirely ready to drag my parents out onto the street exactly like they had done to Cameron. All I had to do was give the signal. All I had to do was nod my head and my parents would be physically thrown out of the building. But a simple eviction was far too easy. It lacked the absolute crushing finality they truly deserved. They needed to sign their own death warrants. I slowly lowered my arms and offered them a thin, razor-sharp smile. "I am not going to call security," I said softly, my eyes locking onto theirs with predatory focus. "Pick up your flowers. follow me to the private elevator. I am inviting you up to my office. We are going to negotiate." The private executive elevator carried us up 50 floors in total suffocating silence. Richard and Catherine stood rigidly in the back corner of the glass-enclosed cab, clutching their absurdly large floral arrangements. I stood at the front, my eyes fixed forward on the rapidly ascending floor numbers. When the silver doors finally parted to reveal my penthouse office, I heard my mother let out a quiet, involuntary gasp. The space was a breathtaking monument to absolute corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire city skyline. A massive custom-built mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by plush leather seating and abstract art pieces that cost more than my parents' current net worth. As they stepped onto the thick, pristine carpet, I watched the sheer panic in their eyes instantly morph into something entirely different. I watched the greed take over. They looked around the room, taking in the unmistakable scent of limitless wealth. In their twisted, status-obsessed minds, they suddenly believed they had won. They thought my invitation to negotiate was actually a desperate plea for reconciliation. They genuinely believed that despite the millions of dollars I now commanded, I was still the pathetic, emotionally starved little girl who would gladly empty her bank accounts just to hear them say they were proud of me. I gestured toward the two leather guest chairs positioned directly in front of my desk. "Have a seat," I instructed calmly. They practically scrambled to sit down, dropping the ridiculous bouquets onto the floor beside them. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the edge of my polished desk. The arrogant, demanding patriarch immediately attempted to reassert his dominance. "We are so glad you came to your senses, Savannah." Richard began adjusting his tie as if he were sitting in a standard boardroom meeting. "We knew you would not let your own flesh and blood sink. Now the bank is demanding exactly $3 million by the end of the business day to clear the lien on the mansion. We need you to initiate a wire transfer directly into our primary checking account. Once the funds clear, we will handle the bank and we can put this entire ugly chapter behind us." Catherine nodded vigorously, leaning in with a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated smile. "And we want to make you a promise, Savannah. We are entirely done with Cameron. He is a criminal. He lied to us, he stole from us, and he humiliated our family name." The ease with which she discarded her golden child was truly a marvel to witness. For 33 years, Cameron was the undisputed king of their universe. Now that his pockets were empty, and the FBI had him in handcuffs, they were throwing him under the bus without a single second of hesitation. "Your father and I spoke in the car on the way over here." Catherine continued, reaching across the desk in a failed attempt to hold my hand. "We are officially cutting Cameron out of the family trust. We are disowning him. We are going to contact our estate lawyers tomorrow and make you the sole legal heir to the family fortune. Everything we have will eventually belong to you. We just need you to save the estate first." I sat back in my leather chair studying their faces. They were offering me the inheritance of a heavily mortgaged mansion and a family name that was currently dragging through the mud of federal indictments. They thought they were handing me a golden ticket. They had absolutely no idea they were holding a lit stick of dynamite. "I understand completely," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly agreeable. "You want me to step in, satisfy the primary lender, and buy the $3 million debt from the bank?" "Yes, exactly," Richard agreed, eagerly clapping his hands together. "You buy the debt, the bank backs off, and our home is safe." I opened the top drawer of my mahogany desk. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not initiate a corporate wire transfer into their personal accounts. Instead, I pulled out a sleek, heavy black folder. I had instructed my corporate legal team to prepare these exact documents the moment Cameron was dragged out of the building, knowing with absolute certainty that my parents would come crawling to my doorstep the second the bank threatened their precious social status. I slid the black folder across the desk until it rested perfectly between them. I opened the cover, revealing a thick stack of legal contracts printed on heavy watermarked paper. "If I'm going to assume a $3 million liability, we have to do this entirely by the book," I explained, tapping my manicured nail against the top page. The bank requires a formalized transfer of liability. These documents will allow me to legally purchase the lien directly from the lender, clearing your names from the immediate default registry. Richard let out a heavy sigh of relief, completely blinded by the prospect of financial salvation. Of course, of course. Standard bureaucratic red tape. He immediately reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his expensive fountain pen. He did not read the contract. He did not even bother to skim the executive summary printed on the very first page. He was a man who worshipped Wall Street, yet his arrogant assumption that he could easily outsmart his daughter completely blinded him to the most basic rule of business: never sign a document without reading the fine print. He aggressively flipped to the back page and signed his name on the dotted line. He pushed the folder over to Catherine, pointing to the second signature line. Catherine did not hesitate either. She practically ripped the pen from his hand and scribbled her name next to his, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. They were entirely focused on the imaginary $3 million wire transfer they thought was coming their way. They had no idea they had just signed comprehensive quitclaim deeds. They had no idea they had just authorized a total unconditional transfer of property assets. They had legally surrendered every single right, title, and interest they held in the Connecticut mansion directly over to me. "There you go," Richard said, leaning back in his chair with a smug, victorious sigh capping his fountain pen. "All signed and legally binding. Now how quickly can you process that wire transfer? The bank is expecting our call." I reached across the desk and pulled the black folder back toward me. I looked down at their fresh, wet signatures. I verified the dates and the notarized stamps my legal team had prearranged. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had locked permanently. I slowly closed the heavy cover of the folder. I looked up at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I offered them a bright, radiant, and absolutely terrifying smile. "Congratulations," I said, my voice ringing with crystal clear perfection. "The documents are perfectly in order. The debt with the bank is officially cleared. However, there is one minor detail." Richard furrowed his brow, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through his arrogant, expectant expression. "Minor detail," he echoed, his voice dropping slightly as he glanced at the heavy black folder resting securely beneath my hands. "What minor detail? You just said the paperwork is in order. You just said the debt is cleared." Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, her fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Yes, Savannah, please do not play games with us. We need that wire transfer confirmation number so we can call the bank and stop the foreclosure proceedings." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool, polished mahogany surface of my desk. I looked directly into my father's eyes, ensuring he felt the full, crushing weight of the absolute reality I was about to drop on him. "I am not giving you a wire transfer confirmation number," I stated, my voice completely devoid of the familial warmth they were so desperately trying to fabricate. "Because I did not wire $3 million into your personal checking account. I bypassed you entirely. My corporate wealth management team wired the funds directly to your primary lender an hour ago." Richard let out a short, nervous laugh, waving his hand as if swatting away a pesky insect. "Well, that is fine. The mechanics do not matter as long as the bank is paid off and the house is safe. As long as our names are cleared from the default registry, we are perfectly happy." "I bought your debt, Richard," I corrected sharply, entirely dropping the title of father, "which means I am the new lien holder. And according to the deed transfer you just enthusiastically signed, I am now the sole legal owner of the mansion." The silence that instantly swallowed the penthouse office was so profound, so incredibly heavy, it felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. Catherine stared at me, her mouth hanging slightly open, her eyes darting back and forth as her brain completely failed to process the sentence. Richard stopped breathing. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. "What did you just say?" Richard whispered the words, barely scraping their way out of his throat. I slowly opened the black folder one more time and rotated it so the bold, legally binding text of the first document faced him perfectly. "You did not sign a loan assumption agreement," I explained. tapping my index finger directly on the title of the page. You signed a quitclaim deed. You legally surrendered all property rights, title, and interest in the Connecticut estate to me. You traded your home to escape a $3 million federal liability. The mansion does not belong to you anymore. It is entirely mine. Richard stared at his own signature, the fresh black ink resting undeniably at the bottom of the page. The absolute blinding delusion that he was a financial mastermind shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He had been completely outplayed by the daughter he had spent 33 years calling a failure. He had blindly walked into my corporate fortress, signed his own death warrant, and handed me the keys to his most prized possession without asking a single question. The realization hit his bloodstream like pure, unadulterated venom. The sheer humiliation of being conned so effortlessly completely bypassed his logic and ignited a violent, uncontrollable rage. "You lying little wretch," Richard roared, his voice exploding with terrifying volume. He lost his mind entirely. He kicked his heavy leather guest chair backward, sending it crashing to the floor. With a primal yell, he lunged across the massive mahogany desk, his hands reaching out violently, his fingers clawing desperately to grab the black folder, or perhaps to grab my throat. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I did not even blink. Before his hands could even graze the polished wood of my desk, the two massive private security guards, stationed discreetly inside my office, sprang into action. They moved with terrifying lethal speed. One guard grabbed Richard's outstretched arm, twisting it sharply behind his back in a brutal compliance hold. The second guard slammed his heavy hand into the back of Richard's neck, driving him forward with overwhelming physical force. They hauled the struggling, screaming patriarch entirely off the desk and slammed him face first into the thick, bulletproof glass wall of the office. The impact rattled the pane. Richard groaned in pain, his face pressed aggressively against the cold glass, his arms pinned immovably behind him by men who were highly trained to neutralize corporate threats. Catherine shrieked in absolute terror, leaping out of her chair and backing away toward the door. "Richard," she screamed, clutching her designer handbag to her chest, her eyes wide with sheer, paralyzing panic. "Let go of me!" Richard bellowed, his voice muffled against the glass, struggling uselessly against the overwhelming strength of the guards. "You cannot do this. I will sue you. I will drag you through every court in this country. That house belongs to me. I built that estate." I slowly stood up from my executive chair. I smoothed the lapels of my navy blue suit, picked up the black folder, and walked around the mahogany desk. I approached the glass wall where my father was currently pinned like a captured animal. I stood inches away from him, looking at his flushed, furious, defeated reflection in the window. "You are not going to sue anyone," I said, my tone echoing with a cold, absolute finality, "because you do not have a single penny to pay a lawyer. You are completely bankrupt. Cameron burned all your liquid cash, and I just legally acquired your only remaining physical asset. You are entirely destitute." I turned my head to look at Catherine, who was trembling violently near the elevator doors, tears of genuine terror finally spilling down her heavily made-up face. She looked at me not as a daughter, but as a terrifying, untouchable entity she could no longer control or manipulate. I looked back at Richard, making sure my next words cut straight down to the absolute core of his soul. "You demanded $15,000 from me for rent because you raised me," I asked, throwing his exact toxic words back in his face with surgical precision. "Well, this house is mine now. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your bags and get off my property." "No," Catherine gasped, falling to her knees on the pristine carpet, her hands covering her face as loud hysterical sobs tore through her chest. "Savannah, please. Where will we go? We do not have anywhere else. We do not have any money. You cannot throw your own mother out onto the street." I looked down at her with a total absence of pity. The woman kneeling on my floor was a stranger. "You threw me out the moment I chose a career you could not brag about at your country club," I reminded her coldly. "You abandoned me in a parking lot on my graduation day. To celebrate a criminal. You made your choice. Now you get to live with the exact consequences of your blinding arrogance." I turned to the head security guard. "Escort them out of the building. If they resist, call the local police and have them arrested for trespassing on Apex Biogen property." and send a message to my private security team in Connecticut. Tell them to be at the mansion at noon tomorrow to oversee the eviction. If they leave a single piece of trash on the floor, deduct the cleaning fee from whatever worthless furniture they try to take with them. The guards yanked Richard away from the glass. He did not fight back anymore. The violent rage had completely burned out, leaving nothing but a hollow, broken, utterly destroyed old man. They dragged him toward the elevator, while Catherine scrambled to her feet, following closely behind, sobbing uncontrollably. They left their massive, ridiculous floral arrangements lying completely forgotten on the floor of my office. Once the elevator doors slid shut, sealing away the last pathetic remnants of my toxic family, I walked over to the bouquets. I picked them up, carried them to the corner of the room, and threw them directly into the trash can. The stench of their desperation was finally gone, and the air in my empire was perfectly clear. The stench of their desperation was finally gone, and the air in my empire was perfectly clear. The very next day at precisely noon, my private security team arrived at the sprawling Connecticut estate. I did not go in person. I had absolutely no desire to watch them pack. I monitored the entire eviction through the live video feed transmitted by the lead security officer's body camera. It was a masterclass in poetic justice. Richard and Catherine, the elite snobs, who once hosted lavish charity galas and sneered at anyone who wore off-the-rack clothing, were now frantically shoving their remaining belongings into cheap brown cardboard boxes. Because their bank accounts were entirely frozen, they could not afford professional movers. They could not afford a moving truck. They had to borrow a rusted, dented pickup truck from a former groundskeeper who only agreed to help out of pure pity. I watched through the crisp, high-definition feed as Catherine dragged a heavy trash bag filled with designer shoes across the pristine hardwood floors she used to brag about. Her makeup was smeared, her hair was a tangled mess, and she was actively weeping as the security guards stood by with their arms crossed, strictly enforcing the 24-hour deadline. Richard carried a heavy box of cheap kitchenware out the front door, his head bowed, entirely stripped of his arrogant patriarch persona. As the rusted pickup truck sputtered to life and rolled down the sweeping driveway. For the last time, the massive wrought iron gates swung shut behind them, permanently locking them out of the high society world they had worshipped over their own daughter. Their new reality was a brutal, unforgiving shock to the system. With no credit, no liquid cash, and a massive foreclosure permanently scarring their financial records, Richard and Catherine were entirely blacklisted from the affluent suburbs. They were forced to rent a cramped, dilapidated one-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. The contrast was staggering. Instead of vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers, they now had peeling yellow wallpaper and a ceiling fan that rattled ominously with every rotation. Instead of manicured gardens and a heated swimming pool, their single window overlooked a noisy, smog-filled highway and a flickering neon sign from a neighboring liquor store. There was no country club to escape to. Their elite friends, the same people Catherine had spent decades gossiping with over expensive brunch, blocked their numbers the second the news of their financial ruin leaked. They were total social pariahs. I received reports from the private investigator I kept on retainer that Catherine spent her days sitting on a cheap, sagging thrift store sofa, staring blankly at the peeling walls, entirely unable to comprehend how she had fallen so far. Richard, the man who used to confidently dictate corporate strategy, was now reduced to scanning the classified ads in the local newspaper, desperately searching for entry-level, hourly wage jobs just to keep the electricity turned on. They were living in a personal hell entirely of their own making. But the destruction of my parents was only the opening act of the grand finale. The true spectacle occurred 3 days later in the most exclusive, heavily gated neighborhood in the state. Cameron had managed to retreat to his upscale rented townhouse after being physically thrown out of the Apex Biogen lobby. He was frantically pacing his living room, surrounded by half-packed suitcases, desperately trying to figure out a way to flee the country before the federal authorities finalized their case. He still believed he had a tiny window of opportunity to escape. He was dead wrong. At exactly 6 in the morning, the tranquil silence of the elite neighborhood was violently shattered A fleet of black unmarked tactical vehicles swarmed the manicured street, screeching to a halt directly on Cameron's pristine front lawn. Dozens of heavily armed FBI agents wearing tactical vests poured out of the vehicles. They did not knock politely. They used a heavy steel battering ram to entirely obliterate his custom mahogany front door, breaching the townhouse with overwhelming, terrifying force. Cameron was tackled to the floor of his foyer before he could even reach for his passport. The agents pinned him aggressively against the imported marble tile, shouting federal commands that echoed out into the quiet street. They read him his Miranda rights clearly and loudly, stating the federal charges of wire fraud, securities fraud, and aggravated identity theft. They dragged him up from the floor, his hands locked tightly in heavy steel handcuffs behind his back. He was wearing silk pajamas, completely disheveled, crying hysterically, as they marched him out the ruined front door and onto the bright green grass of his front lawn. The timing of the raid was flawlessly executed for maximum public exposure. It was the exact hour when the wealthy executives and high society housewives of the neighborhood were out walking their purebred dogs or heading to their luxury vehicles for their morning commute. A massive crowd of elite neighbors had gathered on the sidewalks, watching the golden tech boy being paraded like a captured animal. News helicopters were already circling overhead, broadcasting the live takedown to every local news station in the state. Cameron desperately tried to hide his face, sobbing loudly, pleading with the federal agents to put him in the vehicle. But the agents took their time, forcing him to stand on the lawn in his silk pajamas, while they secured the perimeter and hauled boxes of seized hard drives and financial ledgers out of his house. The neighbors watched in absolute disgust, whispering, rapidly capturing the humiliating scene on their smartphones. The golden child was entirely unmasked. His brilliant tech founder persona was permanently burned to the ground in front of the exact high society audience he had sacrificed his own family to impress. By noon, the footage of Cameron crying in handcuffs on his front lawn was trending across every major social media platform and financial news network. The articles detailed his elaborate Ponzi scheme, his forged documents, and the millions of dollars he had stolen from unsuspecting investors. The family name was not just tarnished. It was completely obliterated. Any lingering shred of respect or status my parents desperately hoped to cling to was entirely wiped off the map. They were the parents of a high-profile federal criminal, bankrupt, homeless, and globally humiliated. I watched the news broadcast from the massive flat-screen television in my penthouse office. I took a slow sip of my freshly brewed coffee, feeling the warm liquid soothe my throat. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city I now helped control. The empire was secure, the toxic rot had been surgically removed, and the board was completely cleared. The empire was secure, the toxic rot had been surgically removed, and the board was completely cleared. But clearing the board was only the first step in maintaining a $20 billion stronghold. As the new chief scientific officer of Apex Bio Gen Y, held absolute veto power over all mergers and acquisitions. My days were suddenly consumed by an endless avalanche of pitch decks, clinical trial data, and startup valuations. While my dual doctorate allowed me to instantly identify fraudulent genetic research and scientifically impossible agricultural claims, evaluating the financial integrity of these companies was an entirely different battlefield. The current financial executives at Apex Biogen had already proven their staggering incompetence. They were the exact same men who had eagerly greenlit Cameron's fabricated spreadsheets simply because he wore an expensive suit and used the right corporate buzzwords. I could not trust them. I needed a financial attack dog. I needed someone who could see through the intricate, deceptive labyrinths of corporate accounting with the same ruthless clarity that I applied to genetic sequencing. There was only one person on the planet who possessed that exact level of unmitigated, terrifying financial brilliance. I sent a secure car to pick up Nia later that week. When she walked through the heavy glass doors of the Apex Biogen penthouse boardroom, the transformation was nothing short of breathtaking. The exhausted, terrified woman in the beige trench coat from the dimly lit coffee shop was entirely gone. The suppressed, perfectly manicured housewife, who had spent a decade shrinking herself to protect Cameron's incredibly fragile ego, had been permanently erased. Nia stepped into the room wearing a striking, tailored emerald green power suit that complemented her rich, dark skin perfectly. She carried a sleek leather briefcase, walking with the posture of a woman who had just single-handedly handed the FBI the roadmap to dismantle a massive federal crime ring. I stood up from the mahogany table and poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, sliding one across the polished wood toward her. She took a seat in the plush leather guest chair, looking around the massive, intimidating corporate fortress with calm, analytical eyes. "How are you holding up?" I asked, taking my seat across from her. Nia offered a genuine, radiant smile. "The divorce is moving forward uncontested, because Cameron is currently sitting in a federal holding cell with no access to legal funds. The authorities froze his accounts, but because I turned state's evidence and proved my signatures were forged, my personal assets are fully protected and separated from his wreckage. For the first time in 10 years, Savannah, I am completely free." I nodded, resting my hands on the table. "You are free, and you are currently unemployed. I want to change that immediately." Nia raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of her water. "I listened as you dismantled my brother in this exact room," I continued, my voice shifting into a sharp professional register. "You untangled a multi-million-dollar cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme, tracked hidden offshore transfers, and compiled a bulletproof forensic audit using nothing but a laptop at your kitchen table. You did all of that while actively playing the role of a supportive tech wife. You possess a level of financial genius that the executives in this building severely lack." I slid a thick, heavy corporate contract across the table. It was not a bridge loan, and it was certainly not a fake buyout offer. "I am officially offering you the position of Chief Audit Executive at Apex Biogen," I stated clearly. "You will report directly to me and Mr. Maxwell. You will have full, unrestricted executive authority to audit every single startup that pitches this conglomerate. You will gut their ledgers, expose their hidden debts, and flag every single fabricated revenue stream. If you say the math is fraudulent, I veto the acquisition. We will operate as an absolute impenetrable wall." Nia looked down at the contract. Her eyes scanned the bold text detailing a 7-figure base salary, massive corporate stock options, and a comprehensive benefits package that would secure her financial independence for the rest of her life. The golden child of our toxic family had used her as a disposable prop, actively forging her name to steal her future. Now the discarded daughter was handing her the keys to a kingdom. Nia looked up from the paperwork. A fierce, deeply emotional fire burned in her eyes. "I spent a decade hiding my intelligence because my husband was terrified of a smart woman," Nia said, her voice completely steady but laced with profound power. "I watched him throw millions of dollars into the garbage while his parents applauded his reckless stupidity. I am never shrinking myself for anyone ever again." She reached into her briefcase, pulled out a silver pen, and signed the contract without a single second of hesitation. The impact of Nia joining the executive team was immediate and absolutely devastating to the old boys club at Apex Biogen. The traditional finance bros in the mergers and acquisitions department attempted to push back against her authority during her very first week. They walked into the boardroom with bloated financial projections for a trendy agricultural tech startup, expecting the new chief audit executive to simply rubber stamp their paperwork. Nia slaughtered them. She stood up, activated the digital smartboard, and systematically dismantled the startup's entire financial history in less than 15 minutes. She exposed hidden liabilities, toxic debt structures, and a highly illegal shell company the startup was using to inflate their quarterly earnings. The finance executives sat in stunned, terrified silence as she ripped their multi-million-dollar proposal to shreds, using nothing but raw math and forensic precision. I sat at the head of the table watching my sister-in-law completely dominate the room and proudly slammed my veto stamp onto the rejected file. Within a month, the entire corporate culture of Apex Biogen had shifted. The scammers, the smooth talkers, and the fraudulent tech founders stopped approaching our conglomerate entirely. They knew that pitching Apex meant facing the firing squad. They knew they had to survive a brutal scientific interrogation from me, followed immediately by a terrifying forensic financial execution by Nia. The two women who were constantly used, abused, and entirely dismissed by Richard, Catherine, and Cameron now sat at the very top of a multi-billion-dollar empire. We did not need their toxic validation. We did not need their conditional love. We had forged our own absolute power out of the exact brilliance they had tried so desperately to crush. Every time we walked down the glass corridors of the 50th floor side by side, we were a living, breathing testament to the ultimate revenge. We were flawless, we were untouchable, and we were running the world. 3 months later, the dust from the explosive collapse of my toxic family had completely settled. The brutal, rapid transition from being the discarded scapegoat to the chief scientific officer of a $20 billion conglomerate had smoothed into a flawless, highly lucrative routine. Naya and I operated Apex Biogen with surgical precision, driving the company to record breaking quarterly profits. I had upgraded my living situation, moving out of my cheap student housing and purchasing a massive multi-million-dollar penthouse suite in the absolute center of the city. I was entirely insulated by wealth, private security, and the profound peace that comes from permanently cutting out a malignant tumor. I had changed my personal phone number, scrubbed my private email addresses, and instructed my security detail to automatically intercept any mail originating from my parents' new zip code. I had built an impenetrable fortress around my peace of mind. But desperate people possess an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to slip through the cracks when they hit absolute rock bottom. It happened on a quiet, rain-swept Friday evening. I was sitting on my plush velvet sofa wearing a silk robe, sipping a glass of vintage red wine while reviewing a stack of international patent applications. The fire crackled softly in the marble fireplace. My secure private cell phone, a number given exclusively to Mr. Maxwell Nia and my top-tier executive staff, began to vibrate against the glass coffee table. The caller ID simply read, "Unknown caller." Normally I would have ignored it. But we were in the middle of closing a massive overseas acquisition, and I assumed it was one of our international legal partners calling from an unregistered line. I reached over, picked up the phone, and swiped to answer. "Savannah, please do not hang up." The voice on the other end of the line was a jagged, desperate rasp. It was heavily distorted by static clearly originating from a cheap prepaid burner phone. I froze, the crystal wine glass hovering inches from my lips. It was Catherine. I did not speak. I simply listened to the chaotic, heavy breathing on the other end of the line. The background noise was completely foreign to the elite country club aesthetic my mother had worshipped her entire life. I could hear the loud, aggressive blare of highway traffic, the wailing siren of a distant police car, and the distinct hollow echo of a cramped, unfurnished room. "Savannah, please say something." Catherine wept, her voice completely devoid of its former aristocratic polish. "I know you changed your number. I had to pay a private investigator the last $200 in my checking account just to track down this private line. Please, you are the only person left in the world who can help us. We are drowning." I slowly lowered my wine glass to the table, leaning back into the cushions. The sheer audacity required to track down my secure line after I had explicitly orchestrated their eviction was staggering. I did not offer a comforting greeting. I did not ask how she was doing. I remained completely silent, forcing her to speak into the cold void. "Your father is completely broken," Catherine sobbed, launching into a frantic, pathetic monologue. "The warehouse job fired him after 2 weeks because his back gave out. We are living in a nightmare, Savannah. The apartment has black mold on the walls. The heating barely works. I am scrubbing toilets at a local diner just to afford canned soup. Our friends abandoned us. Everyone abandoned us. We have absolutely nothing left." She paused, gasping for air, waiting for me to offer a shred of sympathy. When I provided nothing but silence, she pivoted immediately to the true, ultimate reason for her call. Even after everything that had happened, her entire universe still revolved around the golden child. "It is Cameron," she cried, her voice pitching into a hysterical wail. "Savannah, they are going to destroy his life. The public defender the court assigned to him is an absolute joke. He is completely overwhelmed and refuses to fight the charges. He told Cameron to take a plea deal for 15 years in federal prison. 15 years, Savannah. He will not survive in there. He is a sensitive, brilliant boy. He just made a mistake. A mistake. That was the word she chose to describe a multi-million-dollar federal Ponzi scheme, massive identity theft, and the intentional destruction of her own home. The delusion was permanently hardwired into her brain. "You have millions of dollars now," Catherine begged, the desperate greed creeping back into her tone. "We saw the articles. We know about your bonus. Hiring a top-tier, high-powered criminal defense attorney would be absolute pocket change for you. You can afford the best legal team in the country to get him out of this. You have to save your brother. And Savannah, since you have so much now, maybe you could just set up a small monthly stipend for your father and me. Just $5,000 or $10,000 a month. Just enough so we can survive and move out of this horrible neighborhood. We are your family. Blood is thicker than water. Please, Savannah, we are begging you." I sat in the quiet luxury of my penthouse listening to her pathetic, hyperventilating sobs. A year ago, a call like this would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have felt the crushing, toxic obligation to empty my savings account just to rescue them from their own catastrophic decisions. I would have desperately hoped that saving them would finally earn me their love. But sitting there now, holding the phone to my ear, I felt absolutely nothing. My heart rate did not elevate. My breathing remained perfectly steady. The emotional umbilical cord was not just cut, it had been incinerated. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that they had not learned a single lesson. They did not feel genuine remorse for how they had treated me. They simply viewed me as an unlimited bank vault they could guilt-trip into funding their survival. They were a bottomless black hole, and I refused to throw a single penny into the dark. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch for one final agonizing second before delivering the absolute final verdict on our relationship. I did not yell. I did not curse. I responded with a chilling, calm finality that froze the air in the room. "You were right, Mom. My veterinary degree is for treating animals. But at least animals understand loyalty. This family does not." I pulled the phone away from my ear, her frantic screaming pleas still leaking from the tiny speaker, and tapped the red button. The call disconnected instantly. I opened the security settings on my phone, permanently blocked the burner number, and updated my digital firewall to automatically reject any unregistered calls. The execution was complete. The final bridge was burned to ash. I picked up my glass of wine, turned my attention back to my international patents, and never looked back. 2 years later, the crisp alpine air of Geneva, Switzerland, filled my lungs, providing a beautiful and vibrant contrast to the suffocating toxicity I had left behind in Connecticut. I stood quietly in the velvet-draped wings of the massive Palais des Nations auditorium. Beyond the heavy curtains, thousands of the world's most brilliant scientific minds, corporate titans, and international dignitaries murmured in anticipation. The master of ceremonies approached the state-of-the-art podium, his voice echoing perfectly across the sprawling, brilliantly lit hall. He announced my name. He announced my dual doctorate. And he announced that I was the sole recipient of the Global Medical Innovation Award, the highest international honor ever bestowed upon a researcher in the field of agricultural pharmaceuticals. I walked out onto the global stage. I wore a custom-tailored sweeping ivory gown that projected pure, unadulterated elegance and absolute power. As I stepped into the blinding spotlight, the entire auditorium erupted into a deafening standing ovation. I looked out into the massive sea of faces, remembering the empty, lonely parking lot of my university graduation. I was no longer a discarded, financially starved student begging for parental validation. I was a corporate titan, a recognized scientific pioneer, and a woman who had entirely conquered her industry. I accepted the heavy crystal award and stepped up to the microphone. The room fell into a reverent silence. I delivered my acceptance speech with absolute clarity and unshakable confidence. I did not waste a single breath thanking the toxic family who had tried to destroy me. Instead, I locked eyes with Nia, who was sitting in the front row, wearing a stunning designer gown, beaming with fierce, sisterly pride. I thanked her. I thanked Mr. Maxwell. And then I used the ultimate global platform to announce my next major move. I declared the official launch of the Savannah Apex Foundation. Using $50 million of my own personal equity, I established a massive international grant program dedicated entirely to animal welfare and advanced veterinary research. I was taking the exact profession my parents had mocked as a pathetic joke and using it to revolutionize global animal care. Furthermore, I announced a comprehensive, fully funded scholarship trust specifically designed for minority women pursuing degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I wanted to ensure that brilliant, marginalized women like Nia and myself would never have to beg arrogant men for a seat at the table ever again. We were simply going to build our own tables, fund our own laboratories, and run our own empires. While I was standing under the blinding lights of international acclaim, changing the world and securing my legacy, the universe was actively enforcing its absolute merciless justice back in the United States. The stark, horrific reality of my family's new existence was almost poetic in its cruelty. Richard, the arrogant patriarch who used to confidently dictate corporate strategy from his leather armchair, was now wearing a poorly fitting, scratchy polyester uniform. He worked the graveyard shift as a security guard for a discount industrial warehouse. His nights were spent walking the cold, drafty, rain-slicked perimeters of a massive concrete parking lot, shining a cheap flashlight into empty dumpsters. His knees ached constantly, his pride was entirely obliterated, and he was routinely yelled at by a shift manager who was 30 years his junior. There were no more crystal glasses of expensive scotch. There were only lukewarm thermoses of bitter instant coffee, the freezing night air, and the crushing, inescapable silence of his own massive failure. Catherine suffered an even more public, deeply humiliating purgatory. The woman who had prized elite social standing above her own flesh and blood was forced to accept a minimum wage job as a custodial worker. The cruelest twist of fate was her assigned location. Due to her complete lack of marketable skills and her desperate need for cash, she was hired to scrub the floors and sanitize the restrooms at the exact same exclusive country club where she used to hold her lavish weekend brunches. Every single day she had to push a heavy yellow mop bucket through the grand dining room, keeping her head bowed in absolute agonizing shame. The wealthy housewives she used to gossip with walked right past her without a second glance. If one of her former friends dropped a soiled napkin or spilled a mimosa, Catherine had to silently kneel on the floor and wipe it up. She was entirely erased from the high society narrative, reduced to a nameless, invisible servant in her former kingdom. And then there was Cameron, the golden child, the visionary tech founder who was absolutely convinced he was days away from becoming a billionaire. He was currently sitting in a stark, heavily guarded visitation room at a federal penitentiary. The overwhelmed public defender had been completely right. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence Nia had provided, the federal prosecutors completely destroyed him. Cameron took the plea deal to avoid spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. He was officially sentenced to 15 years in a medium-security federal prison. His custom-tailored Italian suits were permanently replaced by a scratchy, oversized khaki jumpsuit. His days of charming venture capitalists and popping expensive champagne on rented yachts were permanently over. He spent his days scrubbing grease off prison cafeteria trays, surrounded by hardened criminals who did not care about his fabricated pitch decks or his arrogant tech vocabulary. He was stripped down to a federal inmate number entirely forgotten by the corporate world he had worshipped. I stepped off the global stage in Geneva, the applause still roaring in my ears. I walked into the private VIP reception area where Nia was waiting with two crystal flutes of the finest champagne. We clinked our glasses together, the crisp sound ringing with the absolute certainty of our victory. That night in Geneva was a flawless international validation of everything I had built, but the most profound moment of closure occurred exactly 1 week later, back on our own turf. I stood on the sprawling private rooftop terrace of the Apex Biogen headquarters. We were 50 stories above the ground, surrounded by a sleek glass parapet that offered an unobstructed 360-degree view of the glittering city skyline. The night air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint electric hum of the massive metropolis sprawling out beneath us. It was a city I used to navigate with the heavy, suffocating anxiety of a broke, unloved student. Now I looked down at the grid of glowing streets and towering skyscrapers with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a woman who owned the board. Nia stood beside me, leaning gracefully against the glass railing. She wore a stunning, perfectly tailored white silk suit that caught the ambient light of the city. She had just finished finalizing the quarterly financial audits for our newest international acquisitions, closing out a record-breaking fiscal year for the conglomerate. She set her sleek digital tablet down on a nearby marble high-top table and picked up a chilled bottle of vintage champagne. She poured the golden, bubbling liquid into two crystal flutes, handing one to me. We did not need to offer a grand theatrical toast. We simply looked at each other, acknowledging the massive, terrifying, and ultimately beautiful journey we had survived. We clinked our champagne glasses together, once more, the delicate chime echoing softly into the night sky. I took a slow sip, letting the crisp, dry champagne cool my throat as I looked out over the glittering horizon. Standing at the absolute pinnacle of corporate and scientific power, my mind drifted into a quiet, profound reflection on the true nature of revenge. For my entire life, society, movies, and pop culture had conditioned me to believe that revenge had to be a loud, destructive, and deeply chaotic event. I used to think that achieving justice meant engaging in endless screaming arguments, desperately trying to force toxic people to understand the pain they had caused. I thought vengeance required malice. I thought it required stooping down to their level, dirtying my own hands in the mud, to ensure they felt the exact same sting of rejection and humiliation I had endured. But looking down at the empire I commanded, I realized with absolute clarity that true vengeance requires none of those things. Retaliation is a frantic, exhausting emotion. It keeps you tethered to the people who hurt you, chaining your energy to their toxic existence. The ultimate, most devastating revenge is not destruction. It is unbothered astronomical success. It is the act of surgically removing your abusers from your reality, cutting off their access to your light, and channeling every single ounce of your energy into your own unstoppable elevation. It is reaching an echelon so incredibly high, so completely fortified by your own brilliance and hard work, that their malicious words can no longer even breach your atmosphere. My parents and my brother had spent decades attempting to break my spirit. They had aggressively mocked my passion for veterinary medicine. They had called my dual doctorate a pathetic joke, a blue-collar failure, and a useless endeavor that would never generate real wealth. They had demanded I pay them for the basic fundamental right to exist in their family. They had tried to force me to co-sign a fraudulent loan, fully intending to sacrifice my financial future to protect a criminal golden child. Yet it was those exact ridiculed skills that became the foundation of my entire fortress. The veterinary science they laughed at was the exact key that unlocked global agricultural gene therapies. The academic rigor they dismissed as pointless earned me a $5 million sign-on bonus, an executive board seat, and absolute veto power over a $20 billion corporate giant. I took the exact weapon they used to mock me and forged it into an impenetrable shield. And Nia had done the exact same thing. The toxic men in her life had treated her as a disposable, naive accessory. They had entirely underestimated her brilliant analytical mind, assuming she would simply look the other way while they destroyed her financial security. Now she was the ultimate financial gatekeeper of an international conglomerate wielding a level of corporate authority that Cameron could not have achieved in 10 lifetimes. We did not have to plant fake evidence to destroy my brother. We did not have to steal my parents' money to bankrupt them. We simply stepped aside established ironclad boundaries and allowed their own blinding greed and monumental arrogance to consume them entirely. The universe had balanced the scales with terrifying precision, and we did not even have to get our hands dirty to watch it happen. The cold night wind swept across the penthouse terrace, catching the hem of my designer jacket. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settle into the deepest parts of my soul. The scared, desperate girl crying in the university parking lot was a distant, fading memory. The woman standing on the rooftop was a titan. I looked down at the millions of city lights, thinking about the massive animal welfare grants I was funding, the brilliant female scientists receiving my scholarships, and the incredible, limitless future stretching out ahead of me. I smiled, letting the final beautiful truth wash over me. They called me a failure. I turned myself into an empire. And the most satisfying part, they have to spend the rest of their miserable lives standing in the shadow of the very tree they tried to cut down. The most profound lesson from Savannah's story is that true vengeance doesn't require malice or stooping to the level of your abusers. Instead, the ultimate revenge is unbothered astronomical success. When toxic people try to tear you down, the best response is to establish ironclad boundaries and channel your energy into building your own empire. You do not have to get your hands dirty or seek active retaliation. The universe often balances the scales when you simply step away. Healing starts when you stop seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding you. Share your own experiences with setting boundaries in the comments below.